"Ma'am, open the door now." The command cut through the silence like something that didn't belong there, sharp and certain, as if the night itself had been given orders. And for a second, the small house at the end of the quiet suburban street just sat there, still and breathing, as though it hadn't decided yet whether to respond. And then came the second sound, louder, heavier, final, the kind that didn't ask twice. And the front door burst inward under the force of it, not shattered in chaos, but forced open with controlled urgency, hinges straining, wood splitting just enough to give way. And suddenly the calm interior was flooded with motion, with beams of white light slicing through darkness, with the rhythmic thud of boots stepping across hardwood floors that had only known quiet footsteps until now. And in the bedroom down the narrow hallway, Imani Brooks woke not with a scream, but with a sharp inhale, the kind that catches halfway between fear and confusion, her heart already racing before her. Mind could catch up, the digital clock beside her bed glowing 2:03 a.m. in soft blue numbers. And for a split second she stayed still, listening, because something in the air felt wrong, not loud, not chaotic, just wrong in a way that pressed against her chest. And then the voices came again, louder now, echoing down the hallway. "Police, stay where you are." Firm, rehearsed, confident, and she sat up slowly, her bare feet touching the cold floor, the house suddenly feeling smaller than it ever had, like the walls had leaned in without warning. And she stepped into the hallway just as another beam of light swept past her face, forcing her to squint, her hand instinctively lifting not in defense, but in confusion. "What is this?" she asked, her voice steady but low, not raised, not panicked, just searching. But the response came not as an answer, but as movement, two officers stepping forward, their presence filling the narrow space, their posture rigid with certainty, one of them gesturing with a quick motion, "Ma'am, stay right there." And she did, because there was no reason not to, because nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment, yet everything in her posture suggested she had learned long ago how to remain calm when the world around her wasn't. And behind them more figures moved through her home, opening doors, scanning corners, their radios crackling softly with coded phrases that blurred together into background noise. And Imani's eyes moved not to their faces, but to the details, the way the light reflected off the picture frames on her wall, the slight tremor in one officer's hand as he adjusted his grip, the faint smell of outside air, carried in with them, cool and unfamiliar inside her space. And still no one answered her question. No one explained why her door now stood open behind them, why her living room lights flickered as shadows passed back and forth, why her night had been interrupted by something that felt less like a mistake and more like a decision already made. And yet she didn't raise her voice, didn't step forward, didn't demand anything. She simply stood there, breathing steady, her gaze level, and said again, quieter this time, "You're in the wrong place." But the words seemed to dissolve before they reached anyone who was listening, because the man at the front, Sergeant Ryan Keller, had already turned away from her, already scanning the interior of the house with a practiced eye, already convinced of something he hadn't said out loud. And as his flashlight swept across the walls, over the neatly arranged furniture, across the small bookshelf and the framed certificates that hung just slightly off center, something in his expression remained unchanged, fixed in that same firm certainty that had brought him here in the first place. And behind him, the rest of the team moved deeper into the house, their footsteps measured, their voices low, filling the space with a tension that wasn't loud but was impossible to ignore. And Imani stood in the middle of it all, not shrinking, not stepping back, just present, her arms relaxed at her sides, her breathing even, her eyes following the light as it moved, as if she were watching a scene unfold that she already understood better than anyone else in the room. And somewhere in that quiet, in that strange balance between intrusion and stillness, between authority and calm, something subtle began to shift, not in the officers, not yet, but in the air itself, like a pause that hadn't been there before, like the night holding its breath, waiting for something none of them had noticed yet. The house no longer sounded like her home, not with the steady movement of strangers filling every corner, not with drawers opening and closing in rooms she had arranged with quiet intention, not with the low static of radios blending into the soft hum of the refrigerator that had been the loudest thing in the house just minutes ago. And Imani remained exactly where she stood, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if the only thing she controlled in that moment was how still she could be. And that stillness carried weight, the kind that did not demand attention but slowly pulled it in, because the longer she did not react, the more noticeable it became. And one of the younger officers, barely older than 25, hesitated for half a second as he passed her, his eyes flicking toward her face and then away again, unsure of what to make of someone who did not match the tension they had brought with them. And down the hallway, Sergeant Keller stepped into the living room, his flashlight beam tracing across surfaces with practiced efficiency. Over the couch, the coffee table, the framed photos that caught the light for a brief second before falling back into shadow. And there was nothing unusual, nothing out of place, nothing that matched the urgency that had brought them here at 2 in the morning. But certainty has a way of drowning out doubt when it arrives first, and Keller moved forward anyway, his jaw set, his focus fixed on something beyond what he could currently see. And behind him, another officer spoke quietly into his radio, confirming location, confirming entry, confirming presence, every word structured, every phrase controlled, as if repetition alone could justify the disruption now unfolding. And Imani listened without interrupting, her eyes shifting only slightly as another beam of light swept past her shoulder and landed on the wall behind her, where a small shelf held a few neatly arranged items. A set of keys, a folded envelope, a book left open face down as if it had been paused mid-thought, and one of the officers reached for the envelope, flipping it over quickly before placing it back without comment. And still no one answered her, still no one explained, and that absence of explanation began to feel louder than the entry itself, because it revealed something deeper than urgency. It revealed assumption. An assumption moved faster than truth in moments like this, and Keller paused, near the center of the room, lowering his flashlight just slightly as he took in the space again, slower this time, more deliberate, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in recalculation, as if something was not aligning the way it should have. And yet he did not stop the process, did not call it off, did not question it out loud, because leadership does not easily admit uncertainty once it has already acted. And so the search continued, quieter now, more measured, less forceful, but still invasive in its presence. And Imani finally took a single step forward, not toward them but slightly to the side, enough to shift her position out of the direct line of movement, her voice calm when she spoke again. If you are looking for something specific, you should say it. And this time someone did respond, though not with an answer, just a glance from Keller, brief and unreadable, before he turned his attention toward the hallway leading deeper into the house, where a faint sliver of light from a partially open door revealed another room beyond. And something about that doorway held his focus for just a moment longer than necessary, not because it stood out, but because it did not. And sometimes the absence of anything remarkable is what begins to unravel certainty. And the officer closest to him followed his gaze, adjusting his grip on the flashlight as he stepped closer to the hallway, the beam now moving slower, more cautious, less certain of what it might reveal. And the air shifted again, subtle but present, like the first crack in something that had felt solid just minutes before. And behind them, the front door remained open, the cool night air slipping quietly into the house, carrying with it the distant sound of a passing car somewhere down the block, a reminder that the world outside continued as normal while inside something was beginning to change, though no one had said it yet. And Imani watched it happen without moving any further, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she had already reached the point they were only just beginning to approach. And whatever they believed they had come for was slowly being replaced by something else. Something quieter, something heavier, something that did not announce itself but made itself known in the pauses between actions, in the hesitation before the next step, in the way Keller now stood at the edge of that hallway, looking into a room he had not yet entered, as if for the first time since arriving, he was not entirely sure what he would find when he did. Sergeant Keller did not move right away, and that hesitation, brief as it was, rippled outward through the narrow hallway like a quiet signal that something had shifted, because until that moment every action had been immediate, every step decisive, and now there was a pause, small but undeniable, and the officer behind him slowed as well, lowering his flashlight just slightly, as if waiting for direction that did not come as quickly as before, and the beam of light drifted across the edge of the doorway, catching dust in the air that had been disturbed by their presence. Tiny particles floating in slow motion, illuminated and then gone. And Keller finally stepped forward, not with the same force as before, but with something more measured, more deliberate, his shoulder brushing lightly against the frame as he entered the room. And the space beyond was not large, not cluttered, just a quiet office, the kind that belonged to someone who valued order over display, with a desk placed near the window, a chair tucked in neatly, and a wall to the right that held a series of items arranged with intention, not decoration, and the light from his flashlight landed there first, sliding across the surface before stopping, not abruptly, not dramatically, just stopping, and for a second nothing was said, because recognition does not always arrive with sound. Sometimes it arrives in stillness, in the way the body adjusts before the mind fully catches up, and Keller's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his shoulders lowering a fraction, his grip on the flashlight loosening just enough to be noticed by someone paying attention, and the officer behind him leaned slightly to the side, following the direction of that light, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in focus, and what they saw was simple, a dark jacket, hanging on a hook, clean, pressed, the letters clear even in the dim light, and beneath it, a badge mounted carefully on a small display, the name visible, Imani Brooks, and there was no immediate reaction, no sharp intake of breath, no sudden movement, just a quiet shift, like a piece falling into place that changed the shape of everything around it. And the radio at Keller's shoulder crackled softly, a voice asking for status. But he did not respond right away, his attention fixed on that wall, on the detail they had missed, on the detail that should not have been missed, and behind them, in the hallway, another officer took a step closer, sensing the change without yet understanding it, his light joining theirs, adding brightness to the room that did not make it clearer so much as it made the silence heavier. And Imani remained where she had been, just outside the room, her presence steady, her gaze directed toward the same wall now, not with surprise, not with urgency, just with a quiet acknowledgement, as if this moment had always been inevitable, as if the truth had been waiting there long before any of them arrived. And Keller finally spoke, though his voice was lower now, stripped of the earlier certainty. Hold on. Just 2 words, but enough to halt the movement behind him, enough to shift the rhythm of the entire scene, and the officers in the living room paused, their steps slowing, their attention turning toward the hallway, because tone carries more weight than words, and his tone had changed, and he stepped closer to the wall, the beam of his flashlight steady now, no longer searching, just confirming, his eyes moving from the jacket to the badge and then back. Again, reading, processing, recalculating, and the certainty that had brought him here began to unravel in quiet layers, not collapsing all at once, but loosening piece by piece. And he reached up slightly, not touching anything, just hovering his hand near the edge of the display, as if proximity alone might offer clarity. And behind him the younger officer spoke, barely above a whisper, "Sir." Not a question, not a statement, just an acknowledgement that something was wrong, that something had been overlooked, and Keller lowered his hand slowly, exhaling through his nose in a controlled breath that did not hide the shift in his focus. And when he turned back toward the hallway, his expression had changed, not dramatically, not visibly to someone who did not know what to look for, but enough to carry weight, enough to alter the balance that had existed just minutes ago. And his eyes met Imani's for the first time since entering the house, not in command, not in accusation, but in something closer to recognition. And the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of everything that had not been said, full of the realization that the roles in this room were not what they had assumed. And the open door behind them let in another breath of cool night air, brushing past the edges of the scene like a quiet reminder that time had not stopped, that the world outside still moved forward, even as inside everything had just changed without a single word needing to explain it. No one spoke for a few seconds, and in that silence the house seemed to return to itself in small, almost unnoticeable ways, the hum of the refrigerator becoming audible again, the faint ticking of a wall clock somewhere deeper inside the home marking time that had not stopped even when everything else felt suspended, and Sergeant Keller stepped back from the wall slowly, not retreating but creating space, as if distance might help him think more clearly, and his flashlight lowered until the beam rested on the floor instead of the evidence that had just shifted the entire situation, and the officers behind him exchanged brief glances, subtle, quick, the kind that did not ask questions out loud but carried them anyway, and one of them reached up to his shoulder radio as if to speak, then hesitated, his thumb hovering over the button before dropping back down, unsure of what exactly to report now that certainty had dissolved, and Keller finally turned fully toward the hallway, his eyes moving past the officers and settling again on Imani, who had not changed position, not stepped forward, not stepped back, simply watching, her presence steady in a way that made the disruption around her feel even more out of place. And when he spoke this time, his voice was different, not louder, not softer, just stripped of the authority it had carried when he first entered. "Ma'am," he said, the word deliberate, careful, as if chosen after consideration rather than habit, and even that single word caused a subtle shift among the others, because language reveals recognition before action does, and he paused for a fraction of a second before continuing. "We are going to need to clarify a few things," and the phrasing was measured, distant from the certainty that had brought them here, and Imani held his gaze without tension, without challenge, her voice calm when she responded. "You should have done that before you came in," and there was no sharpness in it, no raised tone, just a statement placed quietly into the space between them, and it landed with more weight than anything louder could have, because it did not accuse, it simply acknowledged what had already happened, and Keller's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in recognition, and he nodded once. A small motion that did not resolve anything but showed that he understood the point without needing it explained further, and behind him the younger officer shifted his weight, glancing back toward the living room where the front door still stood open, the night air continuing to move through the house in slow, steady breaths. And another officer quietly began closing drawers that had been left open, not out of instruction but instinct, as if restoring order might somehow ease the tension that had settled into the space, and Keller took a step forward into the hallway, stopping just short of where Imani stood, leaving enough distance to avoid intrusion, and he spoke again, more direct this time. "We received a call tied to this address," and even as he said it, the words felt incomplete, insufficient, as if the explanation did not fully account for what they had done, and Imani's eyes did not waver. "And you did not verify it," she replied, the same steady tone, the same controlled delivery, and there was no need for emphasis, because the truth of it was already clear, and Keller exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a brief moment before returning to her, and in that small break in eye contact, the authority he had carried in with him seemed to loosen further, replaced by something more uncertain, more human, and the radio at his shoulder crackled again, louder this time, a voice asking for an update, and he reached up, pressing the button, but when he spoke, his response was shorter than expected. "Stand by." Just 2 words, but they carried a shift in direction, a pause in action, and he released the button, letting his hand fall back to his side, and the officers around him grew still, waiting, watching, because leadership now required a different kind of decision, not how to proceed forward, but how to acknowledge what had already been done, and Imani took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling in a measured rhythm, and she glanced briefly toward the open front door, then back to Keller. "You can close it," she said, not as a request but as a simple observation, and for a second no one moved. Then the younger officer nearest the entrance stepped back, reaching for the door and pulling it gently into place, the sound of it closing soft but final, and the house shifted again, the outside cut off, the focus returning fully to the people inside, and Keller straightened slightly, as if preparing to speak again, but whatever he was about to say did not come immediately, because now the weight of the moment had caught up with him, and for the first time since entering, he was not leading an operation, he was standing in someone else's space, aware of the consequences of every step that had already been taken, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was deliberate, a pause filled with recognition, accountability waiting just beneath the surface, and Imani remained exactly where she was, not pressing, not retreating, simply present, her calm not a shield but a statement, one that did not need to be raised to be understood. The air inside the house settled into a different kind of quiet now, not the calm that had existed before everything began, but a careful stillness, the kind that comes after something has already gone too far to be undone. And Sergeant Keller stood in that space, aware of every detail he had overlooked, every assumption that had carried him through the door without question, and for a moment he did not speak, because there are moments when words feel smaller than what they are meant to address. And this was one of them, and Imani did not fill the silence for him. She did not rush to explain or justify. She simply waited, her presence grounded, her expression composed in a way that made the room feel steadier than it had any right to be. And behind Keller, one of the officers shifted again, quietly stepping back toward the living room, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if he were suddenly aware of the space he occupied, of the objects around him that were no longer just part of a search but part of someone's life. And another officer adjusted his stance near the hallway, his flashlight now lowered completely, no longer scanning, no longer searching, just held at his side. And the radio at Keller's shoulder crackled once more, the voice on the other end sharper this time, asking for confirmation, asking for progress, asking for something that no longer matched the reality inside this house. And Keller pressed the button again, his thumb steady, but his voice measured. "We are assessing," he said, choosing the words carefully, because anything more certain would not have been true, and anything less would have sounded like doubt. And when he released the button, the silence returned, heavier than before, because now it carried awareness, and he looked at Imani again, really looked this time, not at her as part of a situation but as the person standing in front of him. And there was something in that moment that shifted again, something quieter, something more personal, and he spoke, slower now, "Ms. Brooks," using her name as it had been displayed on the wall, not as an assumption but as recognition, and even that small change mattered, because it acknowledged what they had missed, and Imani's eyes remained steady, her voice even when she responded, "Yes," not defensive, not inviting, just present. And Keller drew a breath, one that seemed to carry more weight than it should have, and he continued, "We received a report of suspicious activity tied to this address, but it appears," and he stopped, not because he did not know what to say, but because finishing that sentence required admitting something he had not yet said out loud. And the room felt that pause, every officer aware of it, every second stretching just slightly longer than the one before. And Imani tilted her head just a fraction, not questioning, not prompting, just acknowledging the unfinished thought, and Keller finally completed it. "It appears we acted on incomplete information," and the words settled into the space, quiet but undeniable, and behind him, the younger officer exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, as if the acknowledgement had released something that had been building since they stepped inside. And Imani nodded once, a small motion, not accepting, not rejecting, just marking that the truth had been spoken, and she stepped forward then, not aggressively, not closing the distance fully, but enough to stand in the center of her own home again, reclaiming space without needing to demand it. And she glanced briefly toward the living room where a chair had been slightly moved out of place, where a lamp sat at an angle that was not how she had left it, and then back to Keller. "You did not just act on incomplete information," she said, her tone still calm, still controlled. "You entered without confirmation." And again, there was no accusation in her voice, only clarity, and that clarity carried more weight than anger ever could. And Keller nodded slowly, his expression tightening just slightly as he absorbed the distinction, because she was right, and there was no way around it. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, the entire room suspended in that shared understanding. And then one of the officers near the living room quietly began straightening the chair, adjusting it back into place with careful hands, not as an order, not as a directive, but as an instinctive response to the imbalance that had been created. And another officer closed a cabinet door that had been left ajar, the soft click echoing faintly in the quiet. And these small actions did not fix anything, but they signaled something important, that the energy in the room had changed, that the certainty had been replaced by awareness. And Keller took a small step back, giving Imani more space without being asked, his posture no longer dominating the room, but existing within it. And he spoke again, more directly now. We will need to document what happened here. And even that sounded different, not procedural, not detached, but necessary. And Imani watched him for a moment, then gave a slight nod. You should, she replied, and the simplicity of her response carried its own weight, because it did not escalate, did not diminish. It simply allowed the next step to exist, and outside, beyond the closed door, the faint sound of wind moved through the trees, brushing against the house in a soft, steady rhythm, a reminder that the night had not changed, even if everything inside had. And Keller stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the situation settling fully into place, because this was no longer about what they thought they had found. It was about what they had done, and that difference mattered more than anything else in the room. The room held its breath in a way that felt deliberate now, as if every object inside it understood that something larger than the moment itself was unfolding. And Imani moved with quiet intention toward the edge of the living room, her steps measured, her presence steady, not reclaiming space in a dramatic way, but simply returning to it, as if it had never truly been taken from her. And she reached for the lamp that had been tilted out of place, adjusting it with a small, precise motion until it stood the way it had before, and that single action carried more weight than any words could have, because it was not about the lamp. It was about control, about dignity, about the quiet refusal to let disruption define the space any longer. And behind her, Sergeant Keller watched, not interrupting, not directing, just observing in a way that suggested he was no longer leading but learning. And one of the officers near the hallway cleared his throat softly, not out of impatience but uncertainty, and Keller finally shifted his stance, turning slightly to address his team, his voice low but clear. We are going to step back from the search, and the phrasing was careful, intentional, and it carried a finality that did not need to be emphasized, and the officers responded not with words but with movement, slow, deliberate, each one adjusting their position, lowering their posture. The energy that had once driven them forward now replaced with something more restrained, more aware, and the younger officer who had first hesitated earlier moved toward the coffee table, gently placing an item back where it had been moved, aligning it with the edge as if precision could restore what had been disrupted, and the small sound of it settling into place echoed faintly in the quiet. And Keller took another step forward, stopping just a few feet from Imani, maintaining distance but no longer imposing it. And he spoke again. We will need to file a report on this entry, his tone steady, but now carrying something else beneath it, something closer to acknowledgement than procedure. And Imani turned slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, her voice even. You will also need to explain it. And the distinction was subtle but important, and Keller nodded once, slower this time, because he understood what she meant. That documentation alone would not account for what had happened. That explanation required more than facts. It required responsibility, and the radio at his shoulder crackled again, the voice on the other end sharper now, pressing for clarity, pressing for action, and Keller pressed the button, his response measured. We have identified an error in the call. Verification, stand down on further escalation. And the words carried weight, not just as information, but as correction. And when he released the button, the room seemed to settle again, as if the acknowledgement had shifted something beyond just the people inside it. And Imani crossed her arms loosely, not defensively, just comfortably, her posture grounded. And she glanced briefly toward the hallway where the office door remained open, the wall with the jacket still visible in the distance. A quiet reminder of the detail that had changed everything. And then back to Keller. You came in certain, she said, her tone calm, reflective. That certainty did not come from nothing. And Keller's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance but in thought, because she was not asking a question. She was pointing toward something deeper, something that extended beyond this moment. And he did not answer immediately, because the truth of it was not simple, not something that could be resolved in a sentence. And one of the officers near the door shifted again, his gaze moving between them, aware that the conversation had moved beyond procedure into something more personal, more difficult to define. And Keller finally spoke, his voice lower now. It came from a report that should have been verified more carefully. And even as he said it, the explanation felt incomplete. And Imani held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. And she turned her attention back to the room, taking in the subtle changes, the small adjustments the officers had begun to make, the effort to restore order, and she walked a few steps toward the entryway, stopping near the door that had been closed moments earlier, her hand resting lightly on the frame, and she spoke without turning back. "You can leave when you are ready." And the words were simple, but they carried a quiet authority, not commanding, not dismissive, just allowing. And Keller stood there for a moment, absorbing the shift fully now, because the power in the room had changed in a way that could not be reversed, and he nodded again, more firmly this time, turning to his team with a subtle motion of his hand, signaling the next step without needing to say it out loud. And the officers began to move toward the exit, their footsteps softer now, their presence less imposing, and one by one they passed through the living room, through the space they had entered with certainty and now left with awareness. And Keller remained for a second longer, his eyes meeting Imani's once more, and there was something unspoken there, something that did not need to be explained. And then he turned as well, stepping toward the door, the night air waiting just beyond it, cool and steady, as if it had been there all along, unchanged by everything that had happened inside. The first officer stepped out into the night with a quiet exhale, the cool air meeting his face like a reset he did not quite deserve, and one by one the others followed, their boots no longer heavy against the floor but measured, careful, as if each step now carried awareness of where it landed. And inside the house the absence they left behind felt almost louder than their presence had been, a sudden space where tension used to live. And Imani remained by the doorway, her hand still resting lightly against the frame, watching without expression as the last of them moved past her, their shoulders slightly lowered, their eyes no longer scanning but avoiding. And Sergeant Keller was the last to reach the threshold, pausing just before stepping outside, not blocking the way, not turning fully back, just standing there for a second that stretched longer than the others had. And the porch light cast a soft glow across the edge of his uniform, catching the lines of his posture in a way that made the shift in him visible even without words. And he spoke without raising his voice. "Ms. Brooks," the name deliberate again, grounded, and when she looked at him, he held her gaze for a moment longer than before, as if searching for something he did not expect to find. And then he said, "We will follow up with a formal report." And the sentence sounded complete on the surface, but it carried something unfinished beneath it, something that lingered in the space between them. And Imani nodded once, not because she needed the report, but because she understood the weight of what he was trying to say without saying, and she replied, "You should also follow up with whoever made that call." Her tone steady, not instructive, just clear, and Keller's jaw shifted slightly, a small acknowledgement that the responsibility extended beyond this house, beyond this moment. And he nodded again, slower this time, before stepping out onto the porch, the wood creaking faintly under his weight. And as he moved down the steps, the rest of the team had already begun dispersing toward their vehicles, their voices low, their movements quiet, the urgency that had brought them here replaced by something more subdued, something closer to reflection than action. And the red and blue lights that had painted the street in shifting color now seemed less intense, their rhythm softer against the quiet neighborhood. And Keller paused near the edge of the driveway, glancing back once more, not in suspicion, not in command, but in recognition. And Imani stood in the doorway, framed by the soft light behind her, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, not watching them leave as if she needed confirmation, but simply witnessing the end of something that had already resolved itself. And after a moment, Keller turned away, opening the door to his vehicle, the sound of it closing muted against the night. And one by one the engines started, low and controlled, the vehicles pulling away without sirens, without speed, just movement. And the street slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the distant hum of tires fading into the background, the lights disappearing one by one until the only illumination left was the porch light and the faint glow from inside the house. And Imani remained where she was for a few seconds longer, listening, not for the officers, but for the quiet returning, for the space settling back into itself. And when she finally stepped back inside, she closed the door gently. The sound soft but final, and the house exhaled, the tension that had filled it now gone, replaced by a stillness that felt earned, and she stood there in the entryway, her eyes moving slowly across the room, taking in the small changes, the subtle misplacements, the signs of what had happened without needing to relive it. And she walked forward, her steps unhurried, reaching for the chair that had been adjusted earlier, aligning it again with a careful motion, not because it needed to be perfect, but because it was hers, and control, even in small things, mattered. And as she moved through the room, restoring what she could, the faint sound of her footsteps echoed softly, a steady rhythm that replaced the earlier noise. And in the distance, through the hallway, the office door remained open, the wall with the jacket still visible in the low light. A quiet reminder of the moment everything had shifted, and Imani paused for a second, her gaze resting there, not with pride, not with relief, but with understanding, because this had never been about proving anything. It had been about being seen correctly. And as the house settled fully into silence, the night outside continued unchanged. The same calm, the same quiet, as if none of it had ever happened, and yet inside, something had shifted in a way that would not simply disappear, not in the space, not in the memory, and certainly not in the people who had walked through that door believing one thing and left knowing something else. The house did not feel empty, not in the way it had before the night began, but in a quieter, more deliberate way, as if every wall and every object had absorbed what had happened and was now holding it in silence. And Imani moved slowly through the living room, her steps measured, her breathing steady, not rushing to fix everything at once, not trying to erase the disruption as if it had not occurred, but instead restoring what mattered piece by piece. And she reached for the edge of the coffee table, running her fingers lightly along its surface as if checking that it was still real, still hers, and the faint scent of outside air lingered in the room, cool and unfamiliar, blending with the familiar warmth of her home in a way that felt unsettled but not broken. And she adjusted a picture frame on the wall, straightening it with a small, precise motion, her eyes lingering on the image for just a second longer than necessary, not because it had changed, but because everything around it had. And down the hallway, the office door remained open, the soft light from within casting a quiet glow into the darker corridor, and Imani turned her head slightly toward it, her gaze drawn not by urgency, but by awareness, because that room had become the center of something she had not asked for, but had navigated anyway. And she walked toward it with the same calm pace, her footsteps soft against the floor, each one grounding her more firmly in the space that had always been hers. And as she reached the doorway, she paused, not stepping inside immediately, just standing there, looking at the wall where the jacket still hung, unchanged, undisturbed, as if it had been waiting patiently for someone to notice it. And she stepped in slowly, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the desk as she passed, the wood smooth and familiar under her touch. And she stopped in front of the wall, her eyes moving from the jacket to the badge and back again, not with pride, not with relief, but with something quieter, something closer to reflection. And she reached up, adjusting the sleeve of the jacket just slightly where it had shifted from the earlier movement of air and light, her fingers careful, deliberate, as if restoring its place restored something else as well. And she lowered her hand, stepping back half a pace, her posture relaxed but grounded, and the silence in the room felt different now, no longer heavy, no longer waiting, just present. And she took a slow breath, the kind that settles deep into the chest and stays there. And for a moment she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, not in relief, just in acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred. And when she opened them again, her gaze moved toward the desk, where a notebook lay open, the pen still resting where she had left it hours earlier. And she walked over, her fingers brushing lightly against the page, not writing, not turning it, just touching it as if reconnecting with the version of the night that had existed before everything changed. And she stood there for a second, listening, not to anything specific, just to the quiet itself, to the absence of movement, to the way the house had settled back into its own rhythm. And in the distance, beyond the walls, a car passed slowly down the street, its sound soft, ordinary, a reminder that the world outside had continued without interruption. and inside, Imani stepped back from the desk, turning toward the doorway again, her shoulders relaxed, her expression calm, and she walked back into the hallway, the light from the office fading behind her as she moved. And in the living room, everything now stood almost as it had before, the chair aligned, the lamp steady, the small details restored with quiet intention, and she paused near the center of the room, her gaze moving slowly across the space, taking it in not as something that had been damaged, but as something that had endured, and she walked toward the front door, her hand resting briefly on the handle, not opening it, just feeling its presence, the solid weight of it under her palm. And after a moment she stepped back, letting her hand fall to her side, and the house remained still, steady, unchanged in its foundation even if the memory of the night lingered within it. And Imani stood there for a second longer, her breathing even, her posture grounded, and then she turned away from the door, moving deeper into the house, her steps quiet, her presence calm, as the night continued around her, unchanged, steady, and silent. The night did not rush forward. It stretched, slow and deliberate, as if time itself had decided to give the moment space to settle, and Imani moved through her home with a rhythm that matched it, not hurried, not delayed, just steady. And when she reached the kitchen, she paused for a second, her hand resting lightly on the counter, the cool surface grounding her in something simple, something unchanged, and she turned on the faucet, the sound of running water filling the quiet in a way that felt ordinary, almost comforting, and she let it run for a moment longer than necessary, watching the stream catch the light, clear and uninterrupted, before turning it off again, the silence returning but softer now, less heavy, and she reached for a glass, filling it halfway, taking a slow sip as she leaned back slightly against the counter, her gaze drifting toward the doorway that led back into the living room, where everything now stood in careful order, as if the house itself had chosen to return to balance. And for a moment she simply stood there, listening to the quiet she had restored, and then she set the glass down, her fingers lingering briefly on its edge before she stepped away, moving back toward the hallway, her footsteps soft, measured, and as she passed the office again, she did not stop this time, did not look in, because what needed to be acknowledged had already been seen, and instead she continued toward the bedroom, the space that had been interrupted first, and she paused at the doorway, her eyes scanning the room slowly, taking in the subtle shifts, the way the blanket had been slightly displaced, the way the bedside lamp sat just a fraction off-center, small things that carried the imprint of what had happened without needing to replay it. And she stepped inside, adjusting the blanket with a gentle motion, smoothing it back into place, her hands precise, controlled, and she reached for the lamp, turning it slightly until it aligned again, the light casting the same soft glow it always had, and she stood there for a second, her hand resting on the edge of the dresser, her breathing even, her posture relaxed, and then she moved toward the window, pulling the curtain just a bit to look outside. And the street was quiet now, empty, the earlier presence gone as if it had never been there, the houses still, the night unchanged, and she let the curtain fall back into place, the fabric settling with a soft sound that echoed faintly in the room, and she turned away, walking back into the hallway, her steps steady, her presence calm, and as she moved, there was a sense that the house was no longer holding tension, no longer waiting, but simply existing again, and she returned to the living room, stopping near the center, her gaze moving slowly across the space one more time, not searching, not checking, just seeing, and she took a slow breath, deeper this time, letting it settle fully before releasing it. And in that breath there was no urgency, no lingering confusion, just acknowledgement, and she walked toward the front door once more, her hand brushing lightly against the frame as she passed, not stopping, just moving, and she turned off the porch light, the soft glow outside fading into darkness, leaving the house lit only from within, and the shift was subtle but meaningful, the boundary between inside and outside restored. The night held at a distance again, and she stepped back, her eyes adjusting to the softer light. And for a moment she stood there, completely still, the kind of stillness that does not come from tension but from resolution. And in the quiet, the faint sound of the clock ticked again somewhere deeper in the house, steady, consistent, marking time that had continued all along. and Imani turned away from the door, walking toward the couch, lowering herself onto it with a controlled, unhurried motion, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Her shoulders relaxed, and she leaned back slightly, her gaze directed toward the ceiling, not focusing on anything in particular, just letting the space exist around her. And in that moment, there was no need to replay what had happened, no need to question it, because the truth of it had already settled. And as the minutes passed quietly, the house held its calm, the night remained steady beyond the walls, and Imani remained exactly where she was, present, composed, and entirely in control of the space that had always been hers. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly through the edges of the curtains, a pale gray light replacing the darkness in slow increments. And the house responded in kind, shadows softening, shapes becoming clearer, the familiar space returning fully to itself without needing to announce the change. And Imani remained on the couch, not asleep, not fully resting, just still, her posture relaxed but aware, as if her body had chosen to remain present rather than drift away. And when the light reached her face, she opened her eyes slowly, not startled, not disoriented, just aware that time had moved forward, and she sat up with a controlled motion, her hands resting briefly on her knees as she took in the room again. The same room that had held tension hours before, now quiet, steady, unchanged in its foundation. And she stood, her feet touching the floor with the same calm precision as before, and she moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. And outside, the street looked ordinary, the kind of ordinary that felt almost distant after what had happened. A neighbor's car parked in the driveway, a trash bin near the curb, the faint sound of a morning breeze moving through the trees, and nothing about it suggested that anything unusual had occurred. And she let the curtain fall back into place, turning away without hesitation, because the outside world did not need to confirm what she already knew. And she walked into the kitchen, the same path she had taken hours earlier, her movements familiar, grounded, and she reached for the coffee maker, setting it up with quiet efficiency, the sound of water filling the reservoir, the soft click of the machine coming to life, small, ordinary actions that carried a sense of control. And she leaned lightly against the counter as it brewed, her gaze drifting toward the hallway, where the office door remained slightly open, the light from the morning now reaching further inside, illuminating the wall that had shifted everything the night before. And for a moment she considered walking toward it, but she did not, because she did not need to see it again to understand its impact. And instead she stayed where she was, letting the sound of the coffee maker fill the space, steady, predictable. And when it finished, she poured a cup, holding it in both hands as the warmth settled into her palms, grounding her in the present. And she took a slow sip, her eyes closing for just a second as she did, not an escape, but an acknowledgement of the moment. And then she opened them again, turning slightly as a faint sound reached her from the front of the house. A car slowing outside, not fast, not urgent, just deliberate. And she set the cup down on the counter, her movements unhurried as she walked toward the entryway, her steps quiet against the floor. And she paused near the door, listening, the engine idling for a moment before cutting off, and the sound of a car door opening followed, then closing, measured, controlled. And Imani did not move immediately. She did not reach for the handle. She simply stood there, her posture steady, her breathing even. And a knock came a second later, not loud, not forceful, just a firm, single knock that carried none of the urgency of the night before. And she waited a beat, not out of hesitation, but out of choice. And then she reached for the door, opening it slowly, and Sergeant Keller stood on the other side, alone this time. His uniform the same, but his presence different. No lights behind him, no team, no movement. Just him, standing a few feet back from the door, as if respecting the space he had crossed without permission hours earlier. And he did not speak immediately, and neither did she, because the moment did not need to be rushed. And the morning light fell between them, soft, even, revealing everything, clearly without adding weight. And Keller finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. Ms. Brooks, and the name carried the same recognition as before, but now without the tension that had surrounded it. And he held something in his hand, a folded document, simple, official, and he extended it slightly, not stepping forward, not crossing the threshold, just offering it. And she looked at it for a moment before taking it. Her fingers steady, and she unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the page. The formal language, the acknowledgement, the outline of what had occurred, and she did not react outwardly, did not comment, just read, and Keller stood there, waiting, not shifting, not interrupting, his posture still, his gaze steady but not demanding. And when she finished, she lowered the paper slightly, looking at him again, and there was a pause, not empty, but full of what had already been understood, and he spoke again, quieter this time. It does not fix what happened, and the honesty. And it was simple, direct, and Imani nodded once, because she knew that already, and she held the document in her hand, not gripping it, not dismissing it, just holding it as part of the moment, and the house behind her remained quiet, steady, unchanged, and the morning continued around them, calm, clear, as if offering space for what came next without forcing it into place. Imani did not rush to respond. She held the paper in both hands, the edges resting lightly against her fingers as her eyes moved across it one more time, not because she needed to reread it, but because she understood the weight of what it represented, and the morning light continued to settle around them, soft and even, illuminating the quiet distance between where she stood inside her home and where Keller remained outside, careful not to step forward, careful not to repeat what had already been done. And after a moment, she folded the document neatly, not sharply, not dismissively, just with the same calm precision she had shown the night before, and she lowered it to her side, her gaze lifting back to him, steady, composed, and she spoke, her voice even. No, it does not. And there was no bitterness in it, no raised tone, just a clear acknowledgement that what had happened could not be undone by words on a page. And Keller nodded slowly, his posture unchanged, but something in his expression softened, not in relief, not in expectation, but in acceptance of the truth she had stated, and he glanced briefly past her, not intruding, just noticing the quiet interior of the house, the stillness that had been restored, and then his gaze returned to her, focused, present, and he spoke again. There will be an internal review. The words measured, official, but the tone carried something more personal beneath it, and Imani listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her posture grounded, and he continued, what happened here will be part of that. And he paused, not because he had finished, but because the next part required more than procedure, and he took a breath, subtle but visible, before adding, I will make sure it is addressed properly. And the statement was not loud, not forceful, but it carried weight in its simplicity, and Imani studied him for a moment, not searching for sincerity, not testing his words, just observing, and she gave a slight nod, not as agreement, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement that he had said what needed to be said, and she shifted her weight slightly, her hand still holding the folded document, and she spoke again, her tone unchanged, that is your responsibility. And the words landed with quiet clarity, not dismissing him, not engaging further, just placing the weight where it belonged. And Keller did not argue, did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to argue, and he nodded once more, a smaller motion this time, as if confirming something to himself rather than to her. And the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, not strained, just complete, as if everything that needed to be spoken had already been said. And the morning continued around them, the faint sound of a car passing somewhere down the street, a distant door closing in a neighboring house, ordinary sounds that grounded the moment in something real, something ongoing. And Imani shifted her gaze briefly toward the street, then back to him, and she stepped slightly to the side, not inviting him in, not closing the door, just adjusting her position in a way that made the boundary between them clear, and Keller understood it without needing explanation, his posture remaining where it was, his feet planted just beyond the threshold. And he spoke one last time, his voice quieter now, less formal. I am sorry. And the words were simple, unadorned, not wrapped in explanation or justification, just placed there, and for a moment, they existed in the space between them without response. And Imani looked at him, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady, and she did not accept it, did not reject it. She simply let it stand on its own, because some things are not resolved in a single moment, and she gave a small nod, not to the apology itself, but to the fact that it had been spoken, and then she stepped back, her hand moving to the edge of the door, and she closed it gently, not abruptly, not forcefully, just with a quiet finality that marked the end of the exchange. And inside, the house remained calm, steady, unchanged, and outside, Keller stood for a moment longer, his hand resting briefly at his side, his posture still, before he turned away, walking back toward his car with the same measured steps, the morning light following him as he moved. And inside, Imani remained by the door for a second, her hand still on the handle, her breathing even, and then she released it, turning away without hesitation, walking back into the house that had always been hers, her steps quiet, her presence grounded, as the day moved forward around her, steady, clear, and entirely her own. The house carried the morning forward without effort, light moving slowly across the floor, stretching along the walls in quiet patterns that shifted with each passing minute. And Imani moved within it with the same calm rhythm she had held since the night before, not forcing anything back into place, not pretending that nothing had happened, but allowing the space to exist as it was, steady and unchanged at its core. And she returned to the kitchen, her coffee now cooler but still waiting where she had left it, and she lifted the cup again, taking a small sip as she leaned lightly against the counter, her gaze drifting toward the hallway, not searching, just aware. And the office door remained open, the light from the morning now fully reaching inside, illuminating the wall that had shifted everything. And for a moment she stood there, her posture relaxed, her breathing even, and then she set the cup down, her fingers releasing it with quiet intention, and she walked toward the hallway once more, her steps soft, measured. And as she reached the office, she did not pause this time. She stepped inside fully, the light surrounding her as she moved, and she stopped in front of the wall, her eyes moving over the jacket, the badge, the small details that had gone unnoticed until they could no longer be ignored. And she reached up again, not to adjust anything, but simply to rest her hand lightly against the edge of the fabric, feeling its presence, grounding herself in what it represented. And she let her hand fall back to her side, stepping back half a step, her posture steady, and she turned toward the desk, where the open notebook still waited, and she moved toward it, picking up the pen that rested across the page, her fingers wrapping around it with familiarity. And for a moment she did not write. She simply held it, her gaze on the blank space ahead, and then she lowered the pen to the page, her movements slow, deliberate, as she began to write, not rushing, not filling the space with unnecessary words, just placing down what needed to be recorded, her handwriting steady, controlled, each line forming with quiet precision. And the room remained silent except for the faint sound of the pen moving across paper, a soft, consistent rhythm that matched her breathing. And as she wrote, there was no visible tension in her posture, no hesitation in her movement, just clarity, as if the act of putting it down transformed the moment from something that had happened to something that had been understood. And when she finished, she did not reread it immediately. She lifted the pen, setting it back in its place, and she closed the notebook gently, her hand resting on the cover for a second longer than necessary. And then she turned away, stepping back into the hallway, leaving the door open behind her, the room still lit, still present, but no longer the center of the moment. And she moved back into the living room, her gaze passing over the restored space without stopping, because there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to adjust. And she walked toward the front of the house, her hand brushing lightly against the wall as she passed. And she reached the window again, pulling the curtain back slightly. And outside, the street was fully awake now, a neighbor walking across a driveway, another car pulling out slowly, ordinary movement filling the space that had been so still just hours before. And she let the curtain fall back into place, turning away without lingering, because the outside world had already resumed its rhythm. And inside, she had found hers again as well, and she moved back toward the center of the room, stopping for a moment as the sunlight reached further across the floor, touching the edge of the couch where she had sat earlier. And she looked at it briefly, not with attachment, not with reflection, just acknowledgement. And she took a slow breath, deeper this time, letting it settle fully before releasing it. And in that breath there was no weight, no hesitation, just presence, and she walked toward the kitchen once more, her steps steady, her posture grounded, and as she reached for her cup again, lifting it with the same calm motion, the house remained quiet, not empty, not waiting, just complete, and outside, the day continued forward, unchanged, while inside, Imani Brooks moved through her space with the same quiet control she had always held, not defined by what had happened, but by how she had stood within it. And as the morning light continued to fill the house, there was no need for anything more, because everything that needed to shift already had. The house did not need to prove anything anymore, not to the morning, not to the quiet, and certainly not to anyone who had stepped inside it with the wrong certainty hours before. And Imani moved through it one last time that morning with a calm that no longer carried any trace of interruption, her steps soft against the floor, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but defined the space around her. And the sunlight had fully claimed the room now, stretching across the walls, settling into the corners, touching every surface with the same quiet consistency. And she paused near the center of the living room, her gaze drifting slowly across the details she had restored, the chair aligned, the lamp steady, the small objects returned to their places, not perfectly, not exactly as before, but enough to reflect intention, enough to reflect care, and she took a slow breath, letting it settle deeply before releasing it. And in that breath, there was no tension left. No question, no need to revisit what had happened, because the moment had already resolved itself in the only way that mattered. And she turned toward the hallway once more, her steps unhurried as she walked past the office, the door still open, the light still present, and for a brief second her gaze touched the wall inside, not lingering, not analyzing, just acknowledging, and then she continued past it. Because the meaning of that moment did not need to be revisited to remain true, and she moved toward the front of the house, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the wall as she passed, a small, grounding motion that required no thought, and she reached the door, resting her hand briefly on the handle again, not to open it, not to check anything, just to feel its presence, solid, unchanged, and she stepped back, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, and the silence around her was no longer something to notice. It was simply part of the space, as natural as the light that filled it. And outside, the day continued, distant voices, a car passing, a faint breeze moving through the trees, all of it existing without interruption, without awareness of what had unfolded within these walls. And inside, Imani turned away from the door for the final time, walking back into the center of the house, her steps quiet, her presence grounded, and she reached the couch again, not sitting this time, just resting her hand briefly on the back of it as she looked toward the window, where the sunlight now cast a clear reflection across the floor, a simple, steady image that did not shift with memory, and she stood there for a moment, completely still, not holding on to anything, not letting anything linger beyond what it needed to. And then she moved again, her steps carrying her forward without hesitation, without pause, because the space was hers, the moment was hers, and nothing that had entered it without understanding had the power to remain. And as she walked toward the kitchen once more, the quiet followed her, not as absence, but as presence, something full, something steady, something that did not need to be filled with words, and the house remained exactly what it had always been, a place defined not by what had happened inside it, but by the person who stood within it, calm, grounded, and entirely unchanged where it mattered most. And as the morning light continued to settle, there was no final gesture, no dramatic close, just the steady rhythm of a life returning to itself. And in that quiet, the truth of the night remained, not as a wound, not as a disruption, but as a single, clear moment that had revealed exactly what needed to be seen. Nothing more, nothing less. And it did not echo, it did not linger loudly. It simply existed, like the light on the floor, like the air in the room, like the steady breath that carried forward without effort. Because in the end, nothing in this house had been broken, only something had been revealed, and that was enough.